In the last video, we examined consumer equilibrium, and consumer equilibrium happens at the point of tangency between the budget line, BL1, and the indifference curve, IC1. And this happens at the point of tangency when the slope of indifference curve equals the slope of the budget line. And the slope of an indifference curve we know is marginal rate of substitution between apples and oranges, and this must equal the slope of the budget line, which is given by this price ratio PA by PO. Then we also know consumer equilibrium is the best point for this person. This person is maximizing satisfaction given the budget constraint. So since this person is on his or her best point, we can determine how many units of apples would this person buy and how many units of oranges would this person buy. Now let us do some comparative statics. That is, we compare outcomes under two or more equilibrium points, and that's what we do now. Consider the following. The budget line 1 that we have been looking at is defined when nominal income of a person is $5. Then this person spends entire income on two goods, apples and oranges. Price of an apple is $1 a piece. Price of an apple orange is $1 a piece. Now suppose the nominal income of this person changes to $10 and price of an apple equals price of an orange, which is still $1. Or in other words, the nominal income has doubled and price of an apple and price of an orange have stayed the same relative to BL1. So when we have BL2 in relation to BL1, we know that the real income of this person has increased. And what has happened to the price ratio? It has stayed the same. PA by PO has not changed. So now what we want to do is understand what happens when real income of a person increases or changes and price ratio stays the same. So here we have a diagram where we have BL1. You know how it is defined. Here is BL2, and because real income of this person has changed or increased, the budget line shifts to the right, and these two budget lines are parallel to one another. Why? Because the price ratio has stayed the same, or the slope of the budget line is still the same. And we have now two indifference curves, IC1 and IC2, and this E1 is equilibrium when we have budget line 1 and indifference curve 1. And then E2 is the equilibrium point when we have budget line 2 and indifference curve 2. And so we want to know what happens to consumption of apples and oranges when real income of a person increases and there is no change in price ratio. So based on this, we already know about what happens to consumption choices when we are on equilibrium 1. This person consumes OA1 units of apples, OO1 units of oranges. Now when this person's real income increases and there is no change in price ratio, what happens to consumption of apple? Now it is OA2, or in other words, it has increased by how much? A1 by A2. So let us write this down. Change in consumption of apples. So I'll just write apples, A, and what we find is this is given to us as A1, A2. Similarly, what is the impact of moving to BL2 relative to BL1 is that consumption of oranges has increased as well, and by how much? O1, O2. So let me just write this down. Change in consumption of oranges, I'll just write O, and that we know is O1, O2. Now, change in consumption in apples because of increase in real income and no change in price ratio is referred to as the income effect on what? On apples. And so let me just write this down. Income effect on apples. And how much is that one? That is A1, A2. And what is the income effect on oranges? It will be, let me write this down again. Also, income effect on oranges. And this will equal O1, O2. O1, O2. Let me just move this so that you can read it properly, and here it is. So this is how we can measure the impact of change in consumption due to change in real income and keeping the price ratio the same, income effect. And when you join points like E1, E2, let me just undo this, and when we join equilibrium points like E1, E2, what we get is an income consumption curve. I'll define it in the next slide. So when you join points like E1, E2, what you get is income consumption curve. Now note here in this diagram, when real income of a person increases, what happens to consumption of apples? It has increased. And so apples must be a normal good. And what about oranges? Again, when we see an increase in real income, there's an increase in consumption of oranges. So both goods in terms of this diagram are normal. When real income increases, there's an increase in consumption of apples as well as oranges. Now here's the definition of income effect on apples. And this is the change in consumption of apples when there's a change in real income and there's no change in price ratio, income effect on apples. What about income consumption curve? This is simply a collection of consumer equilibrium points like E1 and E2 when there's a change in real income and no change in price ratio. Now look at this diagram. Again, we are looking at the original budget line, which is BL1, and we have an indifference curve IC1, so we know what will be the equilibrium point. It will be E1. We have the second budget line, which we have called BL2, and here the indifference curve is located elsewhere on this corner, more towards oranges. And so now what we have is this equilibrium point E2. Now based on E1 and E2, we know how many apples and oranges will be consumed, and we also can see what will be the income effect on apples, and that will still be the same in terms of the symbols I'm using. That will be A1, A2. And what will be the income effect on oranges? Again the same in terms of symbols, which will be O1, O2. Now what you find here, and this is interesting, when real income of this person changes or increases, like from here to here, what you find is there is an increase in consumption of oranges. And so when there's an increase in real income and consumption of oranges increases, oranges must be normal or must be considered a normal good. And let me just move this right up here. Oranges are normal, must be normal good. What about apples? Here what you find is the following. When there's an increase in real income, what happens to consumption of oranges? It has fallen. So there's an increase in real income and consumption of apples falls. So here apples must be an inferior good. And so in terms of this diagram, this is what you find. In this case, oranges happen to be normal and apples happen to be inferior. What is normal or inferior? It entirely depends on the preferences of the consumer. In the first diagram that we looked at for income effect, we found both goods were normal. Here we find only one is normal and the other one is inferior. Once again we have the same budget lines BL1 and BL2, and we have IC1, and through this we know what is equilibrium point E1, and now IC2 is located closer to apples rather than to oranges, and so we have this new equilibrium E2, and through this we can figure out how much will be consumption of apples and oranges. And what you find is the income effect on apples is still the same in terms of the symbols I'm using, and that is A1, A2. Let me just type this out, A1, A2. What about income effect on oranges? It is still the same in terms of the symbols I'm using, and that will still be O1, O2. But what you find here is when real income of this person has increased and there is no change in price ratio, what has happened to consumption of apples? It has increased. And so when real income increased, consumption of apples increases, and that means apples must be normal. What about oranges? What you find here is as there's an increase in real income, what has happened to consumption of oranges? It has fallen, and that means oranges must be inferior, and I'm just typing it out. So let me just move this around where you can see it. Let me just place it here. There you go. And so the first case we examined, both apples and oranges happen to be normal. The second case we examined, oranges were normal and apples was inferior. And in the third case we have examined is that apples are normal and oranges are inferior. And so what we find by doing this analysis, or what we can figure out, is the way we have drawn the diagrams, at most one good can be inferior, at most one good can be inferior and no more. And here I've typed out that we find that using indifference curve analysis, at most one good can be inferior, and that simply means either both goods can be normal, or we can have a maximum of one good that can be inferior. So this completes our analysis based on income effect. And once again, what is income effect? It is the change in consumption of a good when real income changes and price ratio stays the same.